This is my true story. I gave my life to build a home and a future for my family. I worked through storms, hunger, and pain so my son could have everything I could not. I never expected the day he would close my eyes with his cruelty, leaving me broken inside. That day changed everything. I learned that love is not always returned and respect is not always given. But I made a choice that no one would forget. Before I share my story, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is now. And please subscribe so my truth reaches others who need to hear it. From the day my son was born, I knew my life would belong to him. I worked before dawn and returned home after nightfall, my body heavy with fatigue, my hands cracked and worn. Every coin I earned was given to make his life better. I built this home with my sweat and my dreams so that he would never know hunger or cold. I gave him clothes, food, and comfort before I thought of myself. I skipped my own meals so he could eat. I wore old clothes so his were new. I carried burdens without complaint because I believed that was the duty of a father. I remember nights when the house was silent except for my breathing. I would sit awake, thinking of his future. I believed every sacrifice I made was planting seeds for his life, seeds of safety, comfort, and success. I thought the years of hardship would build something strong between us. I thought he would grow to see my love in those sacrifices. I thought he would carry my name proudly, with respect and honor. I thought my efforts would give him strength and keep our family bond forever. There were times when my body ached so badly that I wanted to stop working, but I never did. I told myself the pain was a small price to pay for my son's future. I did not count the hours I gave away. I did not count the wounds my back carried. I did not count the nights of loneliness. My pride was in knowing that I built him a world where he could stand tall without worry. I thought that pride would become our connection, father and son, bound by blood and sacrifice. I worked in silence because I thought that was part of my duty. I believed that a father should give without asking for thanks. I gave because I thought love meant giving without measure. I gave because I thought blood would return respect. I gave because I wanted him to have what I could not. I gave because I wanted him to have choices I never had. I gave because I wanted him to be free, even if it meant my own freedom was lost. I gave everything I had, believing it was my job to prepare him for the world. But there was more to it than work. There was a hope that what I gave would return to me in the form of love and respect. I thought that every day I worked, every night I rested with aching bones, would teach him the value of honor. I believed that sacrifice would become a language we both understood. I thought he would carry those lessons in his heart. I thought those lessons would guide him in his own life. I thought they would keep him close to me. For years, I lived this way without complaint. I hid my pain behind my labor. I never asked for recognition or thanks. I gave quietly. I gave because I thought my son deserved it. I gave because I believed family was forever. I gave because I wanted him to remember that love is built on sacrifice. I gave because I thought my life was worth nothing without giving it for someone I loved. I gave because I wanted him to stand tall when I could no longer stand. And still, I hoped that my work would matter. I believed my sacrifices would be returned with care when I grew old. I believed that the years of giving would be answered with respect and gratitude. I believed that the bond of blood would keep us together no matter what. I believed that my son would never forget the foundation I built for him. I believed that my life would be honored by the man he would become. I thought those beliefs were enough to protect our family. But the truth was different. Time taught me that sacrifice can be forgotten, that love can be betrayed, and that respect can fade. I learned that no matter how much a father gives, it does not guarantee honor in return. I learned that blood alone is not enough to keep a family together. I learned that love without respect is fragile, and respect without love is gone. I learned that sacrifice without gratitude is a wound that never heals. I learned these lessons slowly, in silence, while carrying the weight of a dream that was breaking apart. I built my son's future, brick by brick, with my own hands. I carried him through storms and kept him safe when the world was cruel. I thought that my work would become his pride. I thought my sacrifice would become his gratitude. I thought my love would become his strength. But what I did not see was how time could turn love into silence, gratitude into forgetfulness, and respect into cruelty. I did not see how the boy I raised would one day close my eyes with his cruelty. That truth came like a storm I could not stop. The years of giving, the years of silence, the years of hope, they led to a moment I could never undo. A moment when the son I had built with my sweat and pain became the man who destroyed what I had lived for. And in that moment, I knew my sacrifice had to change direction. It could no longer be a gift that was taken for granted. It had to become something that would speak for itself. It had to become a legacy that no cruelty could erase. From that day on, my life of sacrifice became the foundation of my decision. I decided that my giving must have meaning beyond my own endurance. I decided that the years I had lived for him must become a lesson for those who still respected family. I decided that my sacrifice must be remembered not for what I gave, but for what I chose to do when that gift was destroyed. And I decided that I would make a choice that would change everything between us forever. At first, the changes were small, a word spoken with impatience, a glance that carried irritation. I told myself it was the nature of youth, a son learning to walk his own path. I told myself it was just a phase, but slowly, those small signs grew heavier. His words became sharper, his tone colder, his respect for me faded like the fading light of the day. The boy, who once ran into my arms without fear, began to walk past me without a glance. He no longer asked for advice. When I spoke, he would look away. When I offered help, he would refuse it with a sharp word. He treated my presence as an inconvenience, my age as a weakness, and my advice as an insult. He began to speak of me to others in ways that wounded more than his fists could. He mocked my struggles, my work, my life, and every day the wounds grew deeper. But I stayed silent, hoping respect would return. I stayed silent because I believed patience could heal this change. In his eyes, my years of hard work meant nothing. My sacrifices were invisible to him. The food I gave, the roof I built, the nights I spent awake for him, none of it mattered in the world he was creating for himself. He began speaking to me in ways that cut me to the bone, words that were filled with arrogance and scorn. I became an obstacle in his eyes, not a father who had built everything for him. I became someone to dismiss, to belittle, to push aside. It hurt in ways I could not explain. Not the pain of physical injury, but the pain of betrayal. The kind of pain that digs into the soul and does not heal. Every insult became a weight I carried quietly. Every mockery became a scar hidden inside my heart. Every glance of disrespect became a reminder that the bond we once had was breaking. And still, I said nothing. I swallowed my pride and endured in silence. I thought that patience would bring him back to me. But patience became my prison. His arrogance grew bolder. He began to speak of me as if I were already dead. He laughed at my advice and mocked my age. He told others I was weak, that I was behind the times, that I had nothing left to give. I began to feel invisible in my own home. A house built for love had turned into a place where silence and contempt lived side by side. The walls heard nothing but his laughter when he spoke against me. The air became thick with disrespect. His wife watched quietly. She saw the change in him. She saw how he mocked me. She saw how he pushed me aside. Yet she said nothing. She did not defend me. She did not stop him. Her silence became another form of cruelty. Her silence told me that she too had accepted this disrespect as truth. I began to see that the battle was no longer between father and son. It was between respect and neglect, between love and arrogance, between truth and denial. The turning point came when his words became actions. Disrespect turned into force. He did not just ignore me anymore. He began to push me aside, to speak over me, to treat my presence as a burden. His laughter became louder when he saw me struggle. His words became sharper when I offered a thought or memory. He mocked my dreams, my work, my past. He turned my silence into weakness and my sacrifice into shame. My heart broke a little more each day. I began to see the truth clearly. My son no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as an obstacle, an old man who had nothing left to offer. He saw me as someone whose voice could be ignored. He saw me as someone who could be pushed aside without consequence. And in that truth, I found a cold certainty. Patience had failed me. Silence had become the air in which disrespect grew. Respect was gone, replaced by cruelty. And when cruelty becomes stronger than love, something inside a man must change. I knew then that I could no longer wait for change. I could no longer suffer in silence, hoping that respect would return on its own. I understood that respect must be earned and maintained, and when it is destroyed, it must be rebuilt or replaced. My endurance was not proof of love. It was proof of my weakness. My patience had been mistaken for consent. My silence had been mistaken for agreement. And his cruelty told me that the time for silence was over. The growing disrespect was no longer just words or looks. It was a wall between us. It was a wound that would not heal. It was a promise broken, the promise that a father's sacrifice would be honored. I began to realize that my duty was not only to give, but also to protect my dignity. My dignity had been attacked slowly, day by day, until it was almost gone. And protecting it now meant making a choice that would change everything. That choice became clearer with every insult, every laugh, every moment I was dismissed. I knew that the bond of blood could be broken by disrespect. I knew that love could be forgotten when cruelty takes its place. I knew that years of sacrifice could be erased by arrogance. I knew that patience could not stand against mockery. And in that knowing, I began to plan, not in anger, but in clarity. Not for revenge alone, but for justice. From that moment, the growing disrespect was no longer a wound I carried quietly. It became the seed of my decision. I knew I would no longer let my life's work be trampled. I knew I had to act so that the truth of my sacrifice was not buried under his cruelty. I knew that my voice could not be silent anymore. I knew that my son's disrespect must be answered in a way that would never be forgotten. And I began to prepare for what was to come. The night came quietly, but the air felt heavy. I could feel the weight of the growing distance between my son and me pressing into the walls of the house. I had learned that silence can build a storm, that patience can give space for cruelty to grow. And on that night, the storm came in full force. What began as a disagreement became something far darker. What began as raised voices ended in violence. He was angry that night. I do not know if it was my words or his own pride that had built the fire inside him. I remember him walking toward me with a face I barely recognized. Not the face of the boy I raised, but of a man hardened by arrogance. The anger in his eyes was a blade I could feel before it struck. And then it happened. A shove. A force so sharp and deliberate that I stumbled. My back hit the wall with a sudden crash. Pain spread through my bones, but it was nothing compared to what came next. He pressed closer, his hand against me, his breath heavy with fury. The words he spoke were sharp, cutting deeper than the blows. Words that made me understand fully that my son no longer saw me as a father, but as an obstacle, as someone to be conquered, as something to erase. And then came the push that sealed it all, a force that pinned me there, pressing me against the wall as if to shut out my voice forever. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not my body, though my bones still remember the pain, but the trust I had kept all these years. The trust that my sacrifices would be honored, that my years of labor, my sleepless nights, my hunger and hardship would be remembered with respect, that my love would be returned in kindness. All of it disappeared in the way he looked at me that night, a look filled with contempt, as if my life and my struggle meant nothing. I closed my eyes then, not just to the pain, but to the shame that crushed me. It was as if my son had not only struck me, but had taken away my place in his heart. My body was still alive, but my spirit felt dimmed. For the first time, I realized that the cruelty was complete. It was not just in what he did to me, but in how he stripped me of dignity before my own home. He closed my eyes to the truth of what I had been to him. He closed my eyes to the hope that he would ever stand with me again. As I leaned against the wall, tasting the dust of the floor and the bitterness of betrayal, I thought about every moment I had given him everything. Every day of work I had done without rest. Every meal I had skipped so he could eat. Every night I stayed awake so he could sleep in comfort. And now he stood before me, not with gratitude, but with violence. Not with respect, but with cruelty. The weight of that truth pressed harder than the shove against my back. I could hear the silence in the room after the shove, the silence of witnesses, the silence of those who did not intervene, the silence of a home that once held laughter, but now held fear. His wife stood nearby. I could see her face turned away, her eyes downcast. She watched in silence, and that silence cut me almost as deep as his hand. It told me she had chosen not to speak, not to protect me. She had chosen to watch cruelty unfold without stopping it. The hurt in me grew heavier with each passing second. It was not just the pain of that night. It was the pain of years erased in one moment. The pain of a father who had believed in his son, only to be treated as if his life was worthless. The pain of knowing that respect had not just faded, it had been replaced by violence. That love had been replaced by cruelty. And in that pain, a decision began to form. I did not answer his violence with anger. I did not raise my hand or voice. I did not curse him. I only closed my eyes and let the moment pass. But in my heart, I knew this would not end in silence. I knew that this cruelty had changed everything. That this violence was a final sign that my patience had run out. That my sacrifice could no longer be given to someone who saw it as weakness. That my life could no longer be spent for someone who had chosen to close my eyes with cruelty. That night, I lay awake long after he had gone. I thought about what his actions meant. I thought about what I had lost. Not money, not home, but respect, trust, and love. I thought about what I had given him and what he had given back in return, and I understood that cruelty is not an accident. It is a choice that comes from the heart, and his heart had chosen violence over respect, hatred over gratitude, and mockery over love. I decided then that my answer could not be violence in return. Violence would have been too easy. What he had done was cruel, but I knew there was a deeper way to answer. A way that would not just hurt him for a moment, but would change his life forever. A way that would expose the truth of who he was to everyone who mattered. I decided that my revenge would not be hidden. It would be seen. It would be permanent. It would be justice, not rage. That night became a turning point. It was the moment I knew I could no longer remain silent. My son had closed my eyes to the truth of my love, but I would open the eyes of those who mattered. I would show the world what cruelty looked like when it was dressed in the body of a son. I would show that a father's pain is not meant to be hidden. And I would act quietly, without fury, but with purpose. The cruelty of that night did not end with the shove. It stayed in me, in the quiet moments, in the memories that replayed over and over. It stayed as a reminder that respect is earned, not demanded. That love is not given freely when it is treated with contempt. That sacrifice means nothing when it is met with cruelty. And from that night forward, I knew I would no longer give silently. I would answer cruelty with truth, and I would let the world see. That night was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. That night after the cruelty, I did not speak. I did not cry. I did not even move much. I sat alone in the quiet of my room with the faint hum of the house around me. The pain in my back had settled into a steady ache, but the pain in my heart was sharper and deeper. It was a pain I could not dress, a wound that no medicine could heal. My body was bruised, yes, but my spirit was wounded in a way that demanded more than time to mend. I thought of the years I had given him, Every day I had worked for his future was now mirrored by a day he had worked to destroy my peace. I thought of the small things, the mornings I woke before dawn to make sure he had food, the nights I slept on the hard floor so he could have a soft bed, the hours I gave to work without rest so that he would never know hunger. I remembered how I carried him on my back when he was too small to walk, how I shielded him from storms, both of weather and of life. Every sacrifice I had made felt like it had been erased in the moment he shoved me against the wall. I kept replaying the image of that night in my mind, the sound of his breath heavy with anger, the way his face had looked before he struck me, the silence of my daughter-in-law as she watched without stepping in. I thought of my own silence, the way I had swallowed my pain and stayed quiet for years. I thought I was protecting the family by keeping peace, but I realized now that my silence had allowed cruelty to grow. Silence had not been strength. It had been permission. Permission for my own son to treat me as less than human. Sitting in the dark, I understood something painful, that words alone could not undo years of disrespect. That forgiveness alone could not heal wounds so deep. That patience, which I had clung to for so long, had been mistaken for weakness. My silence had not brought him back to me. It had not reminded him of the bond we once shared. It had only allowed him to close his heart further, to harden his pride, and to see me as someone who could be pushed aside without consequence. I thought about the word family. I thought about what it meant to me. I thought about the life I had built so that he could live better. I thought about the trust I had given him, the love I had given him without asking for return. And I realized that trust was broken, that love, when met with cruelty, becomes a wound that cannot heal without change. I realized that I could no longer give without protecting myself, that the man I had raised no longer deserved my sacrifice. In those quiet hours, my mind began to shift from pain to purpose. I asked myself what justice would look like. I asked myself what would make the lesson of that night permanent. Violence had been easy for him to give. Silence had been easy for me to take. But now I understood that my answer could not be in anger. It could not be a fight that ended in more blows. My answer had to be something deeper, something that would remain long after the pain faded. I remembered the nights I had dreamed for his future. I had built dreams for him as if they were bricks of my own soul. I had believed that one day he would stand tall, not only for himself, but for the family that had given him life. But that night, those dreams felt like dust slipping through my fingers. He had not only closed my eyes to my pain, he had closed my eyes to the hope I once had in him. The cruelty was not only physical, it was the destruction of trust, of belief, of love. Sitting alone, I realized that my answer could not be given in words alone. Words could be forgotten. Words could be denied. What was needed was action. Action that would speak louder than silence. Action that would make him understand, not just for a moment, but forever. I knew that the lesson I must give him had to be visible to those he cared about most. It had to reach beyond us, to touch the lives of others who could see the truth. And in that silence, a decision began to take shape. I would not respond with rage. I would respond with quiet determination. I would gather truth like a shield and a sword. I would prepare something that could not be taken away, something that would stand as proof of the cruelty he had shown and the choice I had made in return. I would answer him not in the language of fists, but in the language of justice. I thought of his children. They were innocent in this pain. They had not yet learned what cruelty looked like, but they could. I thought about the kind of lesson I could leave them, one not of hatred, but of truth. I thought about the way respect must be earned and the way legacy must be protected. I thought about what I could give them that their father could not take away. The silence that night was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with resolve. It was filled with a promise that I would not let cruelty go unanswered. It was filled with a vow that the lesson I would give him would not fade with time. I knew that night that this wound, this cruelty, would become the turning point of my life, and I knew that my answer would come not tomorrow, but in the way I chose to shape what came next. I lay in bed that night with my eyes closed, but my mind open to what had to be done. I thought of the power of truth. I thought of the strength in justice. I thought of the peace that could come from standing firm. I realized that the way to honor my own life was to make this cruelty the last act he could commit without consequence. That I must close the door on his betrayal and open a new one for those who still believed in respect. When I finally slept, it was not in peace, but in readiness. I had made a choice to transform my pain into a lesson, to transform my silence into action, to transform my wound into a vow. The silence had spoken, and now it was time for the world to listen. That night of reflection became the foundation for what came next. It became the moment when I decided that my answer would not be destruction, but exposure, that my revenge would not be petty, but permanent, that my son's cruelty would no longer remain hidden in the shadows. It would be revealed in full light, and the truth would speak louder than any blow ever could. The next morning, I woke with the weight of that night still heavy in my chest. My back ached, my teeth ached, but what hurt most was the truth that I could no longer ignore. The silence I had held so long had become my weakness. The patience I had clung to for years had been mistaken for acceptance. I knew then that I could no longer wait. I could no longer pretend that what happened was just a moment of anger that would pass. It was something far deeper. It was a breaking of the bond between a father and a son. I sat at my small desk, alone, and thought about what must be done. Anger burned in me, but it was not the kind that called for shouting or striking back. This anger was colder, sharper. It was the anger that comes from deep betrayal. I realized that my response must be measured and permanent. I did not want to break him physically again, for that would make me no better. What I wanted was to break the power he believed he had over me. I wanted to strip away the pride he held in his cruelty. For days I thought about it quietly, without telling anyone. I thought about my home, the house I had built with my own hands and sweat, the home I had dreamed for my family. That home had been my legacy, but now it had become a battleground for respect. I thought about what mattered most to him, the future he believed was his right. I realized the way to make him understand was to take away what he thought was certain, to remove his pride and leave him with nothing to stand on. I began to speak quietly to myself about justice. Justice was not about revenge in the moment. It was about making truth last. I thought about the law, about the ways a father could protect what was his while still teaching the child who had betrayed him. I thought about my son's arrogance and the way it had been fed by my silence. I thought about how that arrogance could be broken not by force, but by the certainty of truth revealed. The idea took root slowly. I knew I would need proof. I would need words in writing. I would need something that could not be taken away or denied. I began to gather my thoughts like a craftsman gathers tools for a long task. I thought about the papers I had signed long ago when the house became a promise to my son about the inheritance he believed was his without question. I knew I could change that promise if I moved quietly and carefully. I knew I had the right to decide who would inherit, and now I decided. I thought of his children, my grandchildren, and the lessons they could learn. They had not yet been poisoned by their father's pride. They still believed in the goodness of family, though I knew they could see the cruelty he had shown me. I decided that they would be part of the decision, not in anger, but in understanding. I wanted them to see that respect and loyalty are earned, not demanded. I wanted them to know that betrayal must have consequence. With this thought, my resolve grew. I called a lawyer quietly, without telling my family. I explained my wish to change the ownership of my property, to remove my son from what he believed was his birthright. The lawyer told me the process would be delicate. It would require careful preparation, legal documents, and witnesses. I told him I wanted no haste, only certainty. I wanted this decision to be final, unchallengeable, and unshakable. As the days passed, I worked in silence. I wrote letters, I signed papers, I prepared everything as quietly as I could. I thought about my son during these days, how he would never expect such a quiet answer to his violence. He had trained me to silence, but I was no longer silent. My silence now was preparation. My quietness was a shield. I was crafting my answer with care, like an artist working on a masterpiece that would speak long after I was gone. I thought about the moment when it would be revealed. I imagined his face when he learned he had been removed from the inheritance, when he learned that the dreams he thought belonged to him had been sold to strangers. I thought about the faces of his children when they realized their father had been cut out by their grandfather. I did not think of it as cruelty. I thought of it as a lesson that would not fade, a lesson in respect, in dignity, and in the consequences of one's actions. Each night, I lay awake planning. I thought of how this decision would echo through the years, how it would be spoken of at family gatherings long after we were gone. I thought of how my son would walk through life carrying not only the memory of what he had done to me, but also the certainty that what he had lost was not just property, but the trust and respect of his own blood. I thought of how my grandchildren would see him, and how they would understand that legacy belongs to those who earn it. In my quiet preparation, I learned that revenge does not need to be loud to be powerful, that the greatest justice comes without violence, that the deepest wound is made not with fists, but with truth. I realized that the path I was choosing was not one of anger, but of finality. I was not seeking to hurt him in the moment. I was seeking to ensure that what he had done to me would never be forgotten, and that what I had done in return would never be undone. The decision became more than just an answer to his cruelty. It became my statement to my family, to the world, and to myself. It was my stand for dignity, for honor, for the belief that respect cannot be taken for granted. I knew it would not be easy. I knew it would change everything. But I also knew it was the only way to heal the wound he had left. I knew it was the only way to make my silence mean something. That decision became the foundation for what followed. It was no longer about me being hurt. It was about me teaching a lesson that would live beyond pain. I was not acting in haste. I was acting in purpose. I was choosing a path that would leave no room for denial, no space for argument, no shadow of doubt. I was choosing to make my act of justice as certain as the cruelty he had shown me. When at last I put the papers in order, when I signed them quietly and called witnesses, I knew I had done more than answer an act of violence. I had sealed a promise to myself and to my family, a promise that respect would not be given without honor, that legacy would not be handed to cruelty, and that a father's love can be both fierce and final. That day, I knew the path was set. My silence had ended. My decision was complete, and the lesson for my son and my family was about to be told. The morning after I had made my decision, I did not rush to act. I knew this was not a matter of haste. This was a matter of meaning. I wanted my next steps to carry weight, to carry a lesson that could be remembered for generations. I thought of my grandchildren, the children of the son who had closed my eyes with cruelty. They were innocent of his anger, innocent of his choices, but they were not innocent of the world they were growing into. I wanted them to understand something important, that the actions of a father leave marks, but the actions of a grandfather can shape futures. I watched them quietly for days. I saw them laugh in the yard, play without a thought for tomorrow, and I thought about how easily children can be taught. I thought about the truth I wanted them to learn, that respect is not given because of blood, that love without honor can be broken, and that cruelty must be answered. I knew that if I involved them in what I was about to do, they would carry the lesson not as a story told in anger, but as a truth understood in their own hearts. I began to speak to them slowly, quietly, in moments when we were alone. I told them stories of their father when he was young, how I carried him, how I built for him, how I dreamed for him. But I also told them stories of what happens when respect is lost. I spoke without anger, without accusation, but with a weight that comes from years of knowing truth. I wanted them to understand that this was not a decision made in haste or malice, but a choice made with purpose. When they listened, their eyes were wide. They asked questions, not as children who seek trouble, but as children who seek truth. I answered gently, never pushing, never forcing. I wanted them to come to the understanding themselves. I told them that there are moments in life when we must choose who we stand for and who we stand against. I told them that there are moments when silence is no longer enough. And I told them that family is not just about what is given, but about what is earned. I invited them into my study one afternoon, away from the noise of the house. The papers lay quietly on the desk, the documents I had prepared that would remove their father from what they believed was his inheritance. I did not hide them, but I did not rush them either. I let the moment stretch, letting them see the weight of what was before them. I spoke of legacy, of trust, of promises broken and promises kept. I told them that these papers were not just words on paper, but a declaration of truth. They listened in silence. They did not speak, but I could see the understanding in their eyes growing. They did not yet know the full weight of what they were about to sign, but they could feel its importance. I explained to them that signing these papers was not an act of cruelty, but an act of protection. That by signing, they would be securing their own future and ensuring that the lesson of respect and dignity would live on in their own lives. I told them that this was not just about property, but about values. The children looked at me with trust. They had known me all their lives as their grandfather, as someone who carried their father as a boy, as someone who built a home for them to live in. They knew me as a man who worked quietly and gave without asking. And in that quiet understanding, I saw them begin to grasp why this was necessary. I saw them begin to understand that the cruelty their father had shown me could not go unanswered, not for their sake, and not for the sake of their own future. When I finally asked them to sign, I did so with care. I did not rush them. I did not demand it. I asked them if they understood, and they nodded. Their hands were small, yet steady. They pressed their signatures onto the papers with a seriousness beyond their years. Each signature felt like a mark in time, a quiet but permanent act that sealed what I had decided. It was a moment of trust, of understanding, and of quiet justice. As they signed, I thought of my own years, of the years I had given to build and protect. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake to work, of the times I had gone hungry so they could eat, of the days I had borne storms alone so they could sleep safe. I thought of what had been taken from me that night when my son closed my eyes with his cruelty. And I thought of what I was now giving to them, a legacy of truth, respect, and strength. I did not speak of revenge in that moment. I spoke of honor. I spoke of the way a family is built, not on force, but on trust. I told them that by signing, they were choosing to stand for what was right, even when it was hard. I told them that they were becoming part of a story that would teach others what it meant to hold dignity in the face of betrayal. They did not speak, but I could see in their eyes that they understood. When the last signature was made, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I knew the moment was complete. I knew the act was done. And I knew that this decision, made quietly, without confrontation, without bitterness, would carry weight beyond my own life. I knew that my grandchildren, when they looked back, would remember not only the papers they signed, but the lessons behind them. They would remember that respect is not inherited, it is earned. That day, I looked at them and said nothing more. I did not need to. The papers were signed, the decision was final, and the lesson was theirs. They left my study quietly, understanding that they had played a part in something that would change their family forever. And I remained, sitting in silence, knowing that I had acted not in anger, but in the quiet justice of a grandfather who had been wounded and had chosen to protect his legacy. That was the moment I decided. My son's cruelty would not erase my life's work. My son's blindness would not destroy the truth. And his children, my grandchildren, would carry forward a lesson stronger than pain, a lesson written not in words alone, but in the act of signing their own names. And so, I knew the next step was near. I knew that with their signatures, the path to truth, justice, and final closure was set. The story I had been living was about to be told to all. The day I decided to reveal what had been done, I knew the moment had to be quiet, deliberate, and without anger. I did not want to yell. I did not want to beg for understanding. I wanted truth to speak for itself. I knew that when the time came, the silence before my words would carry as much weight as the words themselves. I planned it carefully, as I had planned every step before. This was not about vengeance in the moment. It was about making certain that the lesson I had worked toward for years would be understood clearly, without distortion. I called for a family gathering. It was not a loud announcement. It was not drama. I simply sent word that there would be a meeting. When the day came, I stood quietly at the head of the room. Faces filled the space. Relatives, friends, neighbors, my grandchildren, and of course my son. The air was heavy, though no one yet knew why. There was a subtle tension that pulled at the edges of conversation. People sat in silence, waiting. I could feel my son's pride building, unaware that it was about to be stripped away. I began without accusation. I began with the facts, simple, clear facts. I told them of the years I had spent building for my family. I told them of the sacrifices made in silence. I reminded them of the nights I had worked when my body ached, of the meals I had missed so that others could eat, of the dreams I had laid brick by brick. There was no bitterness in my voice. I spoke with calm certainty, letting the weight of my words rest on the room like dust after a storm. When I saw their attention fixed on me, I placed the papers on the table before us. They lay there quietly, their presence commanding attention. The signatures of my grandchildren glistened softly under the light, each one a mark that would change the course of what was to come. I did not need to explain every detail. The papers were proof. The signatures were proof. The decision was proof. What needed to be said was already written in ink. I looked at my son, and in that look, I gave no apology, no invitation for argument. I simply let him see the truth. That the house he had believed was his birthright was no longer his. That his name was removed from what he had called his legacy. That the future he imagined was no longer his to claim. And I let silence fill the room, giving space for the impact to settle. Silence spoke more powerfully than any word I could have offered. Then I spoke again, softly, but with deliberate clarity. I told the family that the signatures were there not out of spite, but out of a choice to stand for dignity. I told them that my grandchildren had signed because they understood, even in their young years, that cruelty and disrespect have consequences. I told them that these papers were not just legal documents, but lessons written for the future. I told them that in choosing to sign, my grandchildren had chosen to stand for respect and truth. The room was still. There was no applause, no anger at that moment, only silence. People looked from my face to the papers on the table, then to my son, who was now pale, silent, and unable to meet anyone's gaze. His pride, once loud and unshakable, had been stripped away without argument. It had been removed by quiet truth. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, murmurs of understanding, of shock, of sympathy. The air was heavy with the weight of what had been done and what had been revealed. I let them speak among themselves. I did not need to add anything more. My act had spoken louder than any argument. I knew that my son would feel the sting of this revelation long after the gathering ended. I knew that the look in his children's eyes would remind him daily of what had been done and why. And I knew that my own role in this family had changed forever. I had moved from being a man who suffered in silence to a man who had acted with quiet justice. That day, I did not speak of revenge. I spoke of truth, of respect, and of legacy. I told the family that every act leaves a mark, some visible, some invisible. And I told them that my choice to reveal this truth was not to harm, but to teach. To teach that cruelty, when left unchallenged, will grow. And that respect, once lost, must be restored, not by words alone, but by actions that speak louder than words ever could. I watched as the room shifted. My grandchildren sat quietly, aware of the weight they carried. My son sat with his head bowed, unable to speak, unable to deny what was before him. The relatives exchanged looks, some filled with sympathy for me, others filled with shock at the decision. But the truth, quiet and unmovable, stood at the center of the room. It was not my voice that filled the space now, but the weight of the act itself. As the meeting ended, I rose without argument. I looked once more at my son, knowing that no word between us could heal what had been broken, but certain that my decision would forever change him. I stepped away, letting the papers rest on the table, letting the silence carry the truth. I walked out of that room quietly, leaving behind not just a decision, but a legacy written in ink and silence. In that moment, I understood fully that my act of revelation was not merely about property or inheritance. It was about the principle that respect is not given freely, that cruelty has a cost, and that a family's strength lies in honor, not entitlement. The signatures of my grandchildren would forever stand as witnesses to that truth, and I knew that I had not acted in malice, but in justice. And so, the revelation became the turning point, the moment when the quiet act of a grandfather became a lasting lesson for a family, a lesson written in truth, sealed in signatures, and carried forward in silence. A lesson that would live far beyond me, far beyond my son, and deep into the lives of those who would remember this day. The day of the revelation left the house filled with a strange quiet that seemed heavier than any voice could carry. That silence was not empty, it was full of consequence. As the papers lay on the table, their presence more powerful than any argument, my son sat motionless. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes refused to meet mine or anyone else's. Around him, whispers began to rise. They were low, careful words, but they carried the weight of what had just happened. Some spoke of shock, some of understanding, but all of them carried a sense of change, a change that could not be undone. His children, my grandchildren, sat quietly, staring at the papers. Their small hands had signed what no one else dared to say aloud. In that silence, they became witnesses, not to a battle of words, but to the shaping of a family's future. Their signatures were not just marks on paper. They were symbols of truth. They were the voices of innocence carried forward to speak louder than any cries of the past. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew something fundamental had shifted. My son did not speak. His pride, once loud and unshakable, had crumbled without a word. The arrogance that had once carried him now seemed fragile and broken. He had built his life believing that blood and inheritance could protect him, but that day, those pillars collapsed. The people in that room saw it. The neighbors saw it. Even his closest friends could not disguise the look of disbelief in their eyes. The man who had once commanded respect now stood stripped of it, exposed in silence before the eyes of his family. I could hear the murmurs of relatives growing louder, but not in malice. There was a quiet understanding that justice had been served. Some nodded at me with quiet respect. Others looked at my son with a mixture of pity and shame. I noticed the subtle shift in the room, as if the truth I had placed on that table had altered the balance of who we were as a family. My son's position was no longer the same. His authority was gone. His future was no longer his own to claim without consequence. The look in his children's eyes was the most powerful of all. There was confusion there, but also a dawning understanding. They were young, but they understood the weight of what they had signed. Their innocence carried the strength of truth. I saw it in their quiet faces. I saw it in the way they avoided meeting their father's eyes. In that moment, they became not only witnesses, but carriers of a lesson I had given them, that cruelty has a cost, and respect must be earned. I did not speak to my son after the revelation. I let the act itself speak for me. My presence, my silence, and the signatures on those papers were my answer. He could argue, deny, or rage, but the truth was already written, sealed, and witnessed. The cost of his cruelty was no longer theoretical. It was real, visible, and permanent. The inheritance he had taken for granted was gone, replaced with the weight of a lesson he would never forget. The whispers continued long after the meeting ended. They followed us out of the room, down the halls, and into the corners of our lives. Some relatives spoke quietly about how the punishment was just. Others wondered if it was too harsh. But there was no disagreement that something profound had happened that day. The man who had mocked his father, who had closed the eyes of the man who gave him life, had lost more than property. He had lost respect. He had lost legacy. He had lost the quiet certainty that blood alone would protect him. My own heart felt a strange mixture of peace and sadness. I did not revel in my son's fall. I did not celebrate his humiliation, but I understood that it was necessary. I had endured years of disrespect, cruelty, and silence, hoping for change that never came. And when I saw that my silence had been mistaken for weakness, I chose a different path. I chose truth. I chose to ensure that the legacy I had built would survive beyond cruelty. I chose to place that legacy in the hands of those who would honor it. I watched as my son left the room without a word. His shoulders were heavy and his steps were slow. I could see the weight of shame pressing upon him. The room seemed to shift again, a subtle release of tension. People began to leave quietly, with heads bowed and eyes thoughtful. My grandchildren stayed behind, looking at me with quiet understanding. They did not need words to know that something important had been given to them, not just the inheritance, but the truth about respect, dignity, and justice. That day, the house was filled with more than silence. It was filled with an understanding that actions speak louder than words. It was filled with the knowledge that cruelty carries a cost heavier than any punishment a court could give. It was filled with the lesson that respect must be protected and legacy preserved. And for me, as an old man who had endured too much, it was filled with peace. I walked away from that gathering knowing that the fallout would not end there. The truth would follow him. The lesson would follow him. The consequences of his cruelty would echo through his life. And in that quiet knowledge, I found a kind of victory. Not a victory born from anger, but a victory born from justice. I had not only closed a chapter, I had written a lesson that would last beyond my years. The fallout was not just for my son, it was for the entire family. It was a lesson for my grandchildren, for my relatives, for anyone who would hear the story. It was proof that cruelty and disrespect are not without price. That silence can be an act of strength, but truth can be the strongest act of all. And I knew, in my bones, that this was the legacy I wanted to leave behind, not of bitterness, but of justice, respect, and dignity carried forward through generations. And so, as I look back now, I understand that the fallout was not destruction, it was transformation. The room that had once held pain now held a lesson. The papers on that table became more than legal documents. They became a testament to the cost of cruelty and the power of truth. And the silence that followed became my final voice. After the storm of revelation, a calm settled over the house. Not the calm of peace without cost, but the quiet that follows a truth that cannot be denied. That day changed everything, not just for my son, but for the whole family. The air felt different, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. There was an unspoken understanding among those present that something deep and lasting had shifted. The bonds of blood were tested, the weight of respect was measured, and the cost of cruelty became undeniable. The house where this happened seemed to breathe differently, as if it carried the echoes of that moment forever. My son did not speak to me after that day. Not once. He avoided my eyes. He walked past me as if I were a ghost. The words I had never said to him in all those years were now written in the silence between us. He knew what I had done. He knew why. And somewhere deep, he must have understood the depth of my decision. I did not seek his forgiveness. I did not want reconciliation built on empty words. My choice was not about hate. It was about ensuring a lesson would stand beyond my years. It was about closing a door that would never be opened again. The house that I had built with years of sweat, with dreams of shelter and legacy, now belonged to those who had shown me respect, my grandchildren. They became the keepers of what I had built, not because of inheritance alone, but because they had witnessed the truth. They had seen the cruelty that had been hidden behind the smiles and false words. They had seen the choices of their father and had signed a decision that cut him out of what he could not respect. And in doing so, they became part of the lesson I wanted to leave. The relatives, neighbors, and friends spoke quietly in the days that followed. Some supported my decision openly, others whispered their doubts, but all could not deny the shift that had happened. My son was no longer the center of the house, the one who would inherit without question. His absence became a loud truth in every corner of our lives. People treated him differently. Where once there had been greetings and trust, now there was distance and hesitation. His reputation had changed, not because I had told them what happened, but because they had seen the evidence of my decision. My grandchildren approached me in the weeks after, their eyes full of questions. They did not need the full story, but they needed assurance. I told them gently that they had done something important, that they had signed papers not to harm their father, but to protect what was precious. I explained that respect is not given freely, it is earned, and without it, even blood cannot bind a family together. They listened quietly, their small hands holding mine, and in their silence I knew they understood the weight of what they had done. For me, the aftermath was not about revenge or victory in the way the world sees it. It was about peace, a deep, quiet peace that comes when you know you have acted with truth and justice. I could walk without carrying the weight of disrespect in my heart. I could sleep without the burden of silent suffering. I knew I had kept my dignity intact, and I knew that the lesson I had given would live longer than any words I could speak. The silence I carried now was not weakness, but a crown of quiet triumph. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The house, once filled with tension and unspoken pain, began to breathe differently. My grandchildren treated it with care, as if it held more than bricks and walls. They understood it was a symbol of legacy, respect, and a truth that could not be erased. And I, watching quietly from the corner of their lives, knew that my choice had planted something that could grow beyond my years. I had passed on not just property, but a lesson that could shape their lives forever. My son, however, carried something else. He carried the silence of those who have lost everything they believed they owned without realizing what respect truly meant. His pride had been replaced by regret, his arrogance by a quiet shame that only he could feel. I did not seek to watch him suffer, but I knew the weight of his loss would follow him quietly, like a shadow he could never shake. That was the cost of cruelty, and that was the truth he now lived with. The family gatherings changed. My presence became quieter, more reflective. Conversations moved carefully around the past, as though we all knew the boundaries had been redrawn. The house remained in the hands of those who would care for it with respect. My grandchildren became its guardians, and in their eyes I saw the proof that my choice had been the right one. The lesson of that day lived on in their silence and in their care. It became part of who we were as a family, woven quietly into every moment. And I realized, in the quiet aftermath, that I had not only preserved a legacy, I had preserved dignity. I had turned cruelty into a lesson that could not be erased. I had ensured that respect was not something given lightly, but something protected and honored. My son's absence from that legacy was not an act of anger, but an act of truth. It was a choice to let the next generation inherit not only a home, but the memory of what it means to stand for respect. In the end, the aftermath was not about what was lost, but what was gained. It was about the truth that lived in silence, in signatures, in quiet choices. My son had taken my peace for granted, but I had given him a truth he could not ignore. The cost of cruelty was now written into the history of our family. The house was no longer his. The legacy was no longer his to claim. And that was the final act of justice I could give. For me, the aftermath became the peace of an old man who had endured, who had chosen truth over anger, and who had trusted that silence could speak louder than any fight. It became proof that cruelty has a price and that respect must be earned. It became the legacy I wanted to leave, not of bitterness, but of quiet justice, of dignity preserved, and of truth carried forward through the hands of those who understood it. And so, I walk forward now, knowing that the aftermath is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a lesson that will live on. My son lost much that day, but his children gained something far greater. They gained a lesson in respect, in truth, and in the cost of cruelty. And for me, that is the peace I will carry with me until my last breath. Now, as an old man, I look back on that day and every day that followed without bitterness in my heart. I tell this story quietly, not to boast, but to share the truth of what happened and what it taught me. I have learned that cruelty can close the eyes of the heart, and once it does, the only way to open them again is with truth, justice, and action. My son closed my eyes with his cruelty, but I chose to open the eyes of those who would follow me, my grandchildren. I gave them not just my house, but a lesson written in the ink of truth and the paper of justice. In the years before that day, I carried my life in silence. I bore insult and disrespect without reply. I thought patience would heal wounds, that love would eventually restore respect. I thought my silence was strength. But I learned in the harshest way that silence without action becomes permission. I learned that a wound left unaddressed becomes a scar that deepens until it changes the heart completely. My son's cruelty had closed my eyes, but it had also opened my mind to a truth I could not ignore. I could no longer stand still while my dignity and the legacy I had built were trampled. I thought about what it means to be a father. To give life is sacred, but to give life without teaching respect is to build a house without walls. I gave my son everything I had. I gave him a home, safety, a name to honor, but I forgot that respect must be part of what is given. Respect is not built with money or effort alone. It is built with humility, understanding, and the recognition of what one has been given. My son forgot this, and when he crossed that line, I knew my silence had to end. Not with anger, but with a choice that would speak louder than any words. That choice was not made in haste. I thought about it for nights, weighing every possibility, every consequence. I knew that to act would change everything. I knew that to remove him from my legacy would break more than his pride. It would break the expectation that blood alone protects respect. I wanted my grandchildren to see that respect is earned and that cruelty carries a price. I wanted them to understand that standing for what is right often requires difficult choices. I wanted them to inherit not just a house, but a lesson that would outlast me. I called them quietly. I spoke to them gently, without anger. I told them that what they were about to do was not an act of spite, but of justice. That signing those papers was not taking something away, but protecting something precious. I saw their eyes, filled with both confusion and trust. They did not fully understand what it meant then, but they trusted me enough to sign. Their signatures were not just ink on paper. They were a promise to remember, a promise to respect, a promise to carry forward the truth. That day, when I presented those papers, I knew it would change my son forever. I saw in him the look of a man stripped of certainty. The pride he had carried was gone, replaced by silence. The room was heavy with whispers, with questions, with the weight of what had been done. My son did not speak. He could not. His children had signed away his claim, and in doing so, had spoken louder than any argument he could make. The truth had been written, and there was no erasing it. In the months that followed, I watched quietly. I did not gloat. I did not speak of it unless asked. But I saw the change. My son's arrogance faded into regret. His words became quieter, his presence smaller. The house he had once claimed was no longer his, and with that loss came the lesson. My grandchildren, in their innocent way, became the living memory of what had happened. They treated the home with care, with respect, with understanding. They carried forward the lesson I had given them without me needing to speak it again. I have lived long enough to know that revenge does not always come with loud words or dramatic actions. Sometimes revenge comes quietly, in choices made with clarity and justice. I did not want to humiliate my son with shouting or confrontation. I wanted to give him something deeper, a truth that could not be denied, a lesson that would follow him wherever he went. And I wanted my grandchildren to see that respect is not something to be demanded, but something to be preserved and protected. Now, as I sit with the years behind me, I can tell this story without anger. I tell it with calm, because I know I acted with purpose. I tell it because I want others to see that cruelty closes eyes, but truth can open them. I want them to know that respect is not given by default, that love alone cannot cover every wound, that family is more than blood. It is the honor, dignity, and respect we give to each other. And when that respect is lost, it must be restored, even if it takes a lifetime. My son closed my eyes with his cruelty, but I opened the eyes of my grandchildren with my choice. I left them something more than a home. I left them a legacy of dignity, of truth, and of the courage to act when silence becomes betrayal. And I did this without a shout, without a fight, without anger. I let the papers speak. I let their signatures carry the weight of justice. I let my actions become my voice. In the end, I learned that legacy is not in the walls we build, but in the lessons we leave behind. My son lost his claim, but he gained something he could never see: the truth of what his actions cost him. My grandchildren gained more than a home. They gained the knowledge that respect must be earned, that cruelty carries a price, and that truth is a power stronger than pride. So now I tell my story calmly, not to shame, but to teach. Not to boast, but to remind that the most powerful lessons are not spoken in anger, but written in silence and action. My life has been a testament to endurance, to sacrifice, and to justice. And my final thought, the one I carry with me every day, is this: he closed my eyes with cruelty. I closed his future with ink. That is my story. That is my truth. And I share it so that those who come after me will remember that dignity is priceless, respect is earned, and truth is the legacy worth leaving.